And as the election winds down and the world reacts to the outcome, the focus is now on the potential shift in foreign policy as Trump once again enters the White House. Joining us now to break it all down is the Hill's foreign policy reporter, Laura Kelly. Laura, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now let's start here. Trump's ascension to the presidency will, of course, have major impacts on U.S. foreign policy. He campaigned on promises to end the war in Ukraine, and his incoming vice president, J.D. Vance, has been a noted critic of U.S. aid for Ukraine. Do we have an idea on how quickly Ukraine could see U.S. funds and military aid cease? And what exactly is the Biden administration doing before Inauguration Day on January 20th to prepare for Trump taking office?
Yeah. Well, the Biden administration has about $6 billion, $7 billion in funding for military material to send to Ukraine, but it does face this kind of crisis of supply, maybe. We think that the Biden administration will send Ukraine more air defense systems before January 20th to kind of fill out the $6 billion. They can maybe also send them some offensive weapons, some missiles and things, but they have to balance that out with not depleting U.S. stocks. So I think it's unlikely we'll see in the next Trump administration, in the next Congress, that they'll want to pass a new aid package for Ukraine. There's also the question of kind of some of these long-term co-production deals that the U.S. has been working to sign with Ukraine, and maybe what the Trump administration might want to do with those. There was a deal signed between Ukraine and Northrop Grumman to build some weapons together, and a memorandum of understanding between Boeing and Ukraine for the production of drones. And so these are all kind of good for American production, but it's a question of whether the Trump administration will kind of take part in doing the policy on the American government side to ensure that these companies can enter into business with Ukraine and be secure in their investment if the U.S. ends support for things like air defenses, where these companies can't really operate there if they're scared that their investments will be bombed. So those are some of the questions that are coming up.
I want to dive into Russia for a second, Laura. The Washington Post recently reported that Trump has spoken to President Vladimir Putin and the two discussed the war in Ukraine. How different of a relationship could we see between the two leaders, between Trump and Putin, compared to that of President Biden? And what impact will it have on the war in Ukraine overall?
One thing that I'm trying to frame my thinking with President-elect Trump is that he likes to be shocking. He likes to take action, and there's not really a lot of clarity on the long-term strategy. So we hear President-elect Trump talking about wanting to hold a call with Russian President Putin, Ukrainian President Zelensky, and kind of getting them to talk about a negotiated deal. But there's not a lot of clarity on what are Trump's red lines around such a deal. And that is really the open question. And if, let's say, President-elect Trump wants to enter into a deal that supporters of Ukraine feel is not good for Ukraine, Ukraine has some say in this too. They could say that they don't want to enter into that deal. The U.S. could then pull support, and then Ukraine is really maybe reliant on European partners and itself to move forward. And there is also the element of, if President-elect Trump feels that Russian President Putin is not giving him the respect that he wants and the deal that he wants, then he could go to the complete other side and say, we're arming Ukraine to the teeth, and we're going to make, Russia rue the day that it didn't give us what we wanted. So there's decisions that can be made, and it's just not clear what the consequences of those decisions, what the administration is most favorable to.
Sure. And shifting gears now, Trump has been a vocal supporter of both Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. And in the past week, the Israeli Prime Minister has revealed that the two have spoken already 3 times. Is Trump expected to give unwavering support to Israel in its war against Hamas and Hezbollah? And does that include increasing military aid and easing restrictions on how U.S. arms are used in that conflict?
I think it's pretty safe to assume that the Trump administration will be very supportive of Israel and have a rhetoric that is more supportive of Israel compared to the Biden administration. But then there is also this question of what are the goals that President-elect Trump wants to achieve in the Middle East, and in particular related to Iran. And does that match up exactly with what the Israelis want? And so ending this war against Hamas, this war against Hezbollah, people in Trump's world talk about going after the primary source of these threats, which is Iran. And we had the maximum pressure campaign during the first Trump administration. But during that time, also, the Trump administration, President-elect Trump, wanted to negotiate a new nuclear deal with Iran. So it's a question of whether how much President-elect Trump wants to have diplomacy with Iran versus the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where it is much more forceful, much more military focused.
Sticking with this topic, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he's also said that the two see eye to eye on Iranian threats. Are there any concerns that the conflict could spread into Iran with U.S. support?
Again, this is the question of which side is President-elect Trump going to fall on. The maximum pressure campaign was all about really isolating Iran, bankrupting Iran, pressuring Iran. We saw the Trump administration in the first term hit top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani with that the Israelis felt was a bridge too far, and the Israelis didn't go into it. But then on the campaign trail, you hear President-elect Trump talking about how he wants peace, he wants the end to wars. So does he really want to escalate militarily with Iran? Whereas we saw the Biden administration kind of warn Israel off of hitting Iranian nuclear sites, Iranian oil fields, as a way to manage this back and forth that was happening. And so it's not clear. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, sometimes he is a little bit cautious. Sometimes he doesn't want to enter into full escalatory military strikes and uses the U.S. as kind of like holding him back. So it could be that Netanyahu goes out forward, and they've already demonstrated that they have a lot of intelligence in striking Iran and having air superiority. So they definitely have an advantage there, and could have President-elect Trump kind of play like the good cop, like we're holding Israel back, and we can use this to kind of lead towards diplomacy in some essence.
All right, we got to leave it there. Laura Kelly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I will stand here at Arlington as Commander-in-Chief. It's been the greatest honor of my life to lead you, to serve you, to care for you, to defend you, just as you defended us, generation after generation after generation.
President Biden right there honoring veterans, military members, and their families today during the Veterans Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Alongside him was Kamala Harris in their first public appearance since the election. News Nation's Laura Engel joins us now from New York City, where thousands are marching in the 105th annual Veterans Day parade along Fifth Avenue.
Well, the crowds have been out in full force all day long. This is the largest Veterans Day parade in all of America. The historic Fifth Avenue you see here behind me filled with 20,000 participants for Veterans Day. They have represented all 6 branches of the military. This year's Grand Marshal, Dakota Meyer of the Marine Corps, who received the Medal of Honor after serving in Afghanistan. Unlike some federal holidays that are celebrated on the same day of the week each year, but not necessarily the same date, Veterans Day is observed annually on November 11th. November 11th, 1918 marked the end of World War I, and the holiday was first commemorated as Armistice Day the following year. In 1938, it was made a legal holiday, and in 1954, President Eisenhower renamed it to Veterans Day. The day honors all who have served in times of war and in times of peace. Today, the U.S. Census Bureau reports that there are 15.8 million U.S. military veterans. That makes up just over 6% of America's adult population. And only about 0.5% of veterans today served in World War II. The largest share served in Vietnam. The theme of this year's Veterans Day is a legacy of loyalty and service. And this was the 105th Veterans Day parade here on Fifth Avenue. Today's event started off with a wreath-laying ceremony at Madison Square Park. Back to you.
Thank you, Laura. And for months, Americans have been inundated with political ads and footage of candidates campaigning across the country. And now, the 2024 election season is coming to a close. In today's Political Minute, News Nation Chief Washington Correspondent Blake Berman breaks down the stats behind the 2024 presidential campaign.
The 2024 election just about behind us. I'm Blake Berman, host of The Hill on News Nation. President-elect Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris battled it out for months before Election Day. We covered it all, from campaign stops to political ads. Here's a look at the stats behind the race. Now, in total, this election saw nearly $16 billion in spending, $10 billion spent on political advertising alone. The country saw nearly 4 million minutes of political ad time. That's more than 7.5 years worth of content. $2.7 billion in outside spending in support of candidates as well. Now, since mid-July, we saw more than 300 events by the Trump and Harris campaigns. In September and October alone, Trump and Harris visited a total of 100 cities, and pollsters conducted approximately 5,800 polls. The next big campaign cycle comes 2 years from now with the 2026 midterms. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
And you can find more news and analysis from Blake and our colleagues 24/7 on News Nation. To find News Nation on your screen, go to joinnn.com. And that's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Mychael Schnell. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.